The coffee was already hot when Clara Weston came downstairs that morning. She had learned sometime in the years since her mother died to have the coffee ready before her father's boots hit the floor. Not because he asked, he never asked, but because a house like theirs ran on small preventions on the quiet forestalling of moments that might otherwise become storms. She had become very good at prevention, at making herself useful before anyone thought to question whether she was necessary. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and dried sage. Morning light came through the window above the wash basin in a thin, apologetic slant, the way light moves in Arizona in October, as though it knows it is not entirely welcome. Clara stood at the stove with her back to the room, listening to the house breathe around her. The pop of a beam contracting in the cold, the far-off sound of horses at the livery, the particular silence that meant her father was already awake and already thinking about something he had not yet decided how to say. She heard his chair scrape across the floor. She poured the coffee. She turned to bring it to him, and that was when she saw it. A sheet of paper sitting in the center of the kitchen table. Not a letter. Not a bill of sale, though she had seen enough of those in recent years to know their shape at a glance. This paper was formal in a different way, heavier in its intent, with a line at the bottom where someone was meant to press a pen and make something permanent. Her father sat across from it with his hands folded and his eyes on the window. He had not touched his coffee. He was wearing the expression he wore when he had already made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch up with him. "Sign it," he said. "The Apache delegation arrives this afternoon." He did not look at her when he said it. He did not explain. He stood, pushed back his chair with the measured movement of a man who has practiced seeming unbothered, and walked out through the back door into the pale morning. Clara stood at the table. The coffee pot was still in her hand. Hot water dripped from the spout onto the floorboards, one drop at a time, slow and even. She did not move to set it down. She looked at the paper and she looked at the line at the bottom of it, and she began, without meaning to count the drops falling to the floor. 1, 2, 3. She had learned to count things when she was 14 years old, during the 2 weeks her mother lay sick in the back bedroom while the winter pressed down on Copper Hollow like a hand over a mouth. She had counted the boards in the ceiling, the number of times the lantern flickered, the steps between the well and the back door. Counting was a way of staying inside her body when everything else was trying to pull her out of it. 4, 5. She set the AM down. This was the third time in her life that something large had been decided for her without her voice in the room. The first had been her name, Clara. After her father's mother, a woman who had died before Clara was born, and who existed in the house only as a photograph on the mantel and an obligation no one had asked her to carry. She had not minded that one. She had been a baby. Babies do not mind what they are called because they do not yet know they are something that could be called anything else. The second had been Cole Devlin. She had been 19 and he had been 24, and he had sat on her father's porch for 3 consecutive Sunday evenings and said things that sounded in that particular low light like a future. He had dark eyes and clean hands, and he spoke about land the way other men spoke about faith, with total certainty and no doubt that it would be given to him. She had thought then that certainty was the same thing as trustworthiness. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about him in a number of ways that became clear only after her family lost their land, and Cole's visits stopped, and the Sunday evenings became just evenings again, ordinary and gray. She had not cried when he left. She had simply understood something she had been resisting for years, that a woman in Copper Hollow was worth exactly what she could provide, and the moment she stopped providing it, she became invisible. She had spent the 3 years since then making herself as useful as possible and as small as possible, which she had discovered was not as contradictory as it sounded. The third time was now. This paper, this line. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up the pen from the table's edge, dipped it, and signed her name in the deliberate, unhurried script her mother had taught her. Not because she agreed, not because she was not afraid, but because she had looked at the shape of her life from every angle she could manage, and she could not find another direction in which it was heading. She was 22 years old, and the daughter of a man who was running out of options in a town that had been running out of options for longer than she had been alive, and the paper on the table was apparently what peace cost this season. She folded the paper and left it on the table for her father to find. Then she went upstairs to pack. She did not pack much. A change of dress, her mother's small sewing kit because it had been her mother's, and she could not bring herself to leave it. Her journal, a battered thing with a cracked leather cover that she had been writing in since she was 16. A handful of seeds she kept in a folded square of cloth tucked into the bottom of the bag where they would not be questioned. Tomato seeds mostly, some squash. A few things her mother had pressed into her hands the last autumn before she got sick, saying with the particular seriousness of someone who knows they are running out of time to say important things, that a woman who can grow food will never be entirely at the mercy of anyone else. Clara believed her. She still believed her. She sat on the edge of her bed for a moment after the bag was packed, looking at the room she had slept in for 22 years. The quilt her mother had made. The crack in the plaster above the window that looked, if you were the right kind of tired, like a river seen from very high up. The small square of sunlight moving slowly across the floor. She was not sentimental by nature. She did not cry. She simply looked at the room and memorized it the way you memorize a face you are not sure you will see again, methodically and without drama. And then she picked up her bag and went downstairs. The delegation arrived at 4 o'clock as the sun began to lose its ambition. Copper Hollow had turned out for it in the way small towns turn out for things they do not know how to feel about, with a kind of rigid attention that was neither welcome nor refusal. People stood along both sides of the main street, some with their arms crossed, some with their hats in their hands, most with the particular expression of people watching something that is either a miracle or a disaster, and are not yet sure which. Clara stood on the porch of her father's house, which was also the mayor's house, which was also, she supposed, the house she was leaving today, and she watched them come. They came in a line, 7 riders on painted horses that moved with a calm authority that made the horses tied along the livery rail look suddenly anxious and apologetic. The warriors rode straight and without theater, not performing anything, not trying to be seen in any particular way. They simply moved through the town the way a river moves through a canyon, as though the landscape has no choice but to accommodate them. And in the middle of the line, riding alone in a way that was different from the others, without being obvious about it, was a man she understood immediately was the one this concerned. He was not what she had expected. She was not entirely sure what she had expected. Something more dramatic, perhaps. Something that matched the stories that had circulated through Copper Hollow for as long as she could remember, stories that made the Apache sound like weather, like a force rather than a people. What she saw instead was a man of perhaps 30 who sat his horse with the posture of someone carrying something heavy that he had decided a long time ago he was not going to put down. He had a broad, still face, and his eyes, when they moved across the crowd, did so slowly and without anxiety. He was not afraid of what he saw, but he was not pleased by it either. He was simply present in the way that certain people are present, thoroughly and without apology, occupying the space he was in without requiring anything from it. His name, she had been told, was Sato. She watched him ride, and she looked for the things she had been told to look for. The danger, the foreignness, the quality of threat that the men in her father's parlor had been discussing all morning. She did not find them. What she found instead was something she recognized in an oblique way, the look of a person who is doing something they did not choose and have decided to do it with dignity anyway. She recognized it because she was doing the same thing. The ceremony was brief and graceless, held in front of her father's porch, with a translator standing between them and a small crowd of witnesses who maintained the watchful silence of people at a proceeding they are not sure is legal. Her father spoke. The senior Apache elder spoke. The translator moved words back and forth between languages, and Clara stood with her hands folded and her breathing even and her eyes on the middle distance. Then Sato stepped forward. He spoke in Apache, low and measured. The translator rendered it, "I do not take, I stand beside." That was the vow. That was all of it. Then he extended his hand toward her, not to take her hand, not to claim anything. He held his hand out with the palm facing upward open, as though he were offering something rather than demanding it. Clara looked at his hand, brown skin and weathered knuckles, a faint scar across the base of the thumb. No ring, no chain, just a hand, waiting, asking without words whether she would choose to place hers in it. His hand was warmer than she expected. That was the detail she held on to afterward in the hours that followed, when the ceremony was done and the crowd dispersed, and she was helped onto a small dun horse, and the line of riders turned away from Copper Hollow without music or ceremony or any of the noise that ought to accompany the end of one life and the beginning of another. His hand had been warm. She filed that away and did not examine it further. They were 2 hours out from Copper Hollow when Cole Devlin appeared in her memory, as he had a way of doing at inconvenient moments. Not his face exactly, but his voice. The particular tone he had used as the Apache delegation was preparing to depart, speaking quietly to his associate near the edge of the porch. She had been close enough to hear without being close enough for him to realize it. "She'll be back in 2 weeks," he had said. "Women like her don't last." He had not said it cruelly. That was the thing that stayed with her. He had said it with the calm certainty of a man stating a fact about weather, about how rivers run, about the reliable nature of things. He had been that certain about her. She had been, for one long moment, almost angry enough to cry. Then she had climbed onto the dun horse, and she had made sure her back was straight when she did it. The land changed as they rode west and then south, the flat scrub giving way to red rock formations that rose from the earth like the remnants of something much larger and older, something that had stood here for so long that it had forgotten it was made of the same material as everything else. The sky above was enormous, in the way that Arizona sky is always enormous, as though someone had made a mistake and given this particular piece of the earth more sky than it knew what to do with. They did not speak on the ride, not to her, not among themselves, not in any language she could hear. The silence was not hostile. It was simply the silence of people who have been together long enough that they do not need to fill the space between them with noise, and she was not yet part of that understanding. She found to her surprise that she did not mind the silence. She had spent the last 3 years in a house full of the wrong kind of noise, the sound of things not being said, of conversations that circled the difficult center of things without ever landing on it, of a father who spoke at length about politics and commerce and never once asked his daughter how she was sleeping. This silence at least was honest. It was not pretending to be anything other than what it was. As the sun dropped toward the canyon rim and the rock around them turned from red to something closer to the color of dried blood, Clara reached into her bag without looking down and pressed her fingers against the folded cloth where the seeds were kept. Still there. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding, and she rode on into the darkening country. They made camp at a creek bed where a thin line of cottonwoods suggested the presence of water even before she could hear it. Sato dismounted and helped her down with steady, impersonal hands, the hands of someone who has helped someone off a horse before and is thinking about other things. He handed her a flask of water and walked a few paces away without explanation. She drank. The water tasted of pine and something mineral and clean. He built the fire. She unpacked what she had been given to carry. The silence between them had a shape now defined by the space of the camp, and she found herself mapping it the way she had learned to map any new territory, with careful attention and without conclusion. He laid out a bedroll for her near the fire. Then he carried his own to the far side of the camp a good 10 feet away and laid it in the dust without ceremony and without looking at her for acknowledgement. Clara sat with her blanket around her shoulders and looked at the fire and thought about this. She had been told things. By the women of Copper Hollow in the careful, indirect way women in Copper Hollow communicated things they could not say plainly. She had understood from these conversations that her situation carried a particular category of fear, and she had carried that fear with her on the road today without letting it show on her face. He had not touched her. He had not crowded her. He had not watched her with hunger or possession or any of the things she had been bracing against. He had handed her water and given her the side of the fire nearest the warmth, and then removed himself to a distance that could only be intentional. She was not naive enough to believe this answered everything. She had known this man for half a day. She did not know what he wanted or what he intended or what the days ahead looked like from where he was standing. But she knew this. He had had every opportunity, every social permission, every precedent that the terms of this arrangement provided, and he had not used any of it. She lay back on the bedroll and looked up at the sky, which was doing something extraordinary with stars spreading them across the dark in a density she had never seen from inside the town's glow. A coyote called from somewhere up on the ridge. She thought of her mother, which she often did when she could not sleep. Specifically, she thought of something her mother had said in the last autumn when she had still been well enough to sit outside in the evening and watch the light leave the mountains. Clara had been helping her shell beans, and her mother had looked up from the work and said with the abruptness of someone who has been thinking something for a long time and decided to say it before the moment passes, "Marriage is more than closeness. It is choosing to stay when you are free to go." Clara had not entirely understood it then. She had thought it was advice about commitment, about not running when things became difficult. She was starting to think it might mean something else. The fire crackled between her and the sleeping shape of a man she did not know. The night pressed in around the small circumference of warmth. She pulled the blanket tighter. She was not certain what this was going to become, but she was certain as she lay there in the enormous quiet of the Arizona night that it was not what she had feared. She closed her eyes. She slept. The village of the Pinal Band sat in a bowl of red rock and morning light tucked between canyon walls that caught the dawn and held it like water held in cupped hands, luminous and still. Clara saw it first from the ridge above before they descended. 7 or 8 structures of various sizes built low against the earth in rounded shapes that seemed to grow from the ground rather than stand on top of it. Smoke from morning fires rising in thin, straight columns through air that had no wind in it yet. The sound of children before she could see them, that particular universal noise of children in the morning, bright and formless and unconcerned with anything. She had not known what to expect. She had grown up on stories that were not stories so much as warnings, and warnings have a way of replacing the reality of a thing with the shadow of it. What she saw from the ridge was not a shadow. It was a place where people lived with the particular dense specificity of any place where people have lived for a long time, where the land has been shaped by human presence, and human presence has been shaped in return by the land. She kept her face neutral as they rode down. The people of the village came out as the riders appeared, not rushing, not making any display of it, simply becoming present in the way that people come into doorways and step out from between structures when something worth observing occurs. Some of them looked at her directly. Some did not. She did not attempt to read what any of it meant. She had learned very young that the meaning you assign to a stranger's expression is almost always more about you than about them. Sato dismounted first. He spoke briefly to an older man who had come forward, and the two of them exchanged something that might have been news, and then Sato turned and gestured for Clara to follow him, not as a command, as an indication of direction, and she followed him past a low fire ring and between 2 structures to a dwelling built into the slope half below the earth and half above it, with a frame of bent willow over the doorway and the smell of ash and cedar coming from inside. He held back the doorway covering for her. She stepped inside. It was dim and clean, a low bed of furs in one corner, a line of baskets along the far wall woven tightly and with a precision that spoke of hours and patience. A central hearth cold now with a clay pot and a wooden implement laid beside it. Nothing that was there without reason. Nothing that was there for show. She stood in the middle of the space, not yet knowing where to put herself. Sato set her bag down near the wall. He did not unpack it. He pointed to the hearth and then to the pot and made a brief gesture that she understood to mean water-fire warmth. Then he stepped back out through the doorway. She was alone. She sat down on the edge of the fur bed spine, straight hands folded in her lap. Then she caught herself doing it, caught herself performing posture for an empty room, and she made herself stop. She let her shoulders drop. She breathed out slowly. She looked at the baskets on the wall. Every one of them had been made by hand. She could see the marks of it, the slight variations in tension, the places where the weave tightened and loosened as the maker's hands had tightened and loosened. They were beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with decoration, and everything to do with the intelligence of the craft, the way the shape of each basket had been thought through before it existed, the way the function and the form had been worked out together. She reached out and touched one. She thought of her mother's garden, which had had the same quality. Not ornamental, not arranged for anyone else's enjoyment, just a place where things grew according to a logic that her mother understood completely, and that had seemed when Clara was young like a kind of magic, but which she now understood was just knowledge accumulated carefully over time. The thought landed softly somewhere in her chest and stayed there. Sato returned at dusk with wood and a bundle that smelled of meat and something sharp and herbal. He stoked the fire without speaking, set a pot to heat, and disappeared again. When he came back a second time, he handed her a bowl of stew and a wooden spoon and sat down across the hearth to eat his own. She tasted it cautiously. It was rich and unfamiliar with flavors she did not have names for, but it was nourishing in a way she felt immediately a warmth that moved through her from the center outward. She kept her eyes on her bowl, but her ears open. Outside, a child laughed at something. Someone answered in Apache. There was the sound of movement, the specific rhythm of evening in a place where people are settling toward rest. These were the ordinary sounds of a community, not strange, not threatening, just people at the end of a day. When the meal was finished, Sato gestured to the fur bed. Then he pointed to the opposite corner of the dwelling where he had placed his own bedroll. He met her eyes for just a moment, long enough for her to understand that the arrangement was intentional, that he was telling her something, and then he looked away. No words, just space offered again. She nodded once and lay down, and she heard him settle into his corner, and the fire burned down between them to a steady, contained warmth, and she looked up at the curved ceiling of the dwelling and thought about the particular shape of this silence. She had lived in silence before. Her father's house had been full of it in the years after her mother died, but that silence had been the silence of absence of things not said, because there was no one left who wanted to say them, of rooms that felt smaller than their dimensions, because no one in them was truly present. This was different. This silence had weight. It had a texture that she could not yet name, but could feel against her skin like the warmth of the fire. Something that was alive in it, something that occupied the space between them without filling it. She slept better than she had slept in 3 years. In the morning he was gone. In his place on the low table beside the hearth was a folded cloth with bread inside, still warm enough to mean he had not been gone long, and a clay cup of water with a sprig of something aromatic laid across its mouth. She sat up and ate the bread in the quiet of the dwelling, looking at the baskets on the wall and listening to the village come awake around her. Then she went outside. The morning was cold still, the canyon walls holding the night's temperature long after the sun had crested the rim. Children ran past her in a laughing knot without pausing in their argument over something she could not see. 2 women were working together near a fire, doing something with hides, talking in voices that rose and fell in a rhythm that sounded even without comprehension, like friendship. Clara stood in the space between the dwelling and the main area of the village and breathed the air, which smelled of wood smoke and sage and the particular mineral quality of the canyon, and she tried to decide what to do with herself. She was not by temperament a person who stood still and waited to be told. She was considering her options when she became aware of being watched. Not intrusively, not unkindly. She turned her head slowly and found an elderly woman seated beneath a cottonwood tree whose roots had found some underground water source and grown enormous in the finding of it. The woman was small and compact and very still, with a face so deeply lined that her expression seemed to reside in the topography of her skin rather than in any one feature. Her eyes were sharp and dark and not unkind. She looked at Clara for a moment, then she patted the ground beside her. Clara crossed the open space and sat. The woman touched her own chest. "Ada." "Clara," Clara said. Ada nodded, a single slow movement, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she reached into the bag at her side and produced a small comb made of carved bone, and without asking or explaining she began to work it through Clara's hair, which had come loose from its braid somewhere in the night and was considerably worse for it. Clara sat very still. No one had touched her hair since her mother died. Not once in 8 years. She had braided it herself every morning in the mirror above her washstand, tightly and efficiently, without sentiment. She had not realized until this moment how long she had been doing everything efficiently and without sentiment. She felt Ada's hands move through her hair, steady and warm, finding the tangles and working them loose without pulling. She looked straight ahead. She did not cry. But it was closer than she had expected. They sat under the cottonwood for a long time until Ada had braided Clara's hair in a style she did not recognize, but which felt, when Ada tied it off with a thin strip of leather, somehow right for the landscape around her. Then Ada reached into her bag again and brought out a strip of dried meat and offered it to Clara with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who has long since stopped making ceremony out of kindness. Clara accepted it. They sat together in silence, which was, she was beginning to understand, a currency here that had more value than she had assigned to it in the world she came from. That afternoon, she found the book. She had been arranging her few things along the wall of the dwelling, making the space feel less like a place she was visiting and more like a place she was in, which she knew from experience required a small number of specific moves, and she had moved one of the baskets to create a shelf of sorts for her journal and her sewing kit, and behind the basket in the shadowed corner was a book. It was old. The cover was worn smooth from handling the binding, cracked along the spine in the way of books that have been opened many times. She picked it up and looked at the cover. Self-Reliance and Other Essays. Ralph Waldo Emerson. She stood with it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was not just the weight of paper and binding. She opened to the first page. There, in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write as an adult and took nothing about the act for granted, were the words, "Forsato," from Teacher Morrison, 1874. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked around the dwelling, at the baskets at the hearth, at the neatly rolled bedding in the corner, at all the evidence of a life lived with intention, with nothing wasted and nothing kept without purpose. Sato. A man who had been given an English book 8 years ago. A man who had said on the road not a single word of English in her hearing. A man whose eyes, she realized now, reviewing the scenes of the last day and a half with this new information laid against them, had moved in ways she had attributed to something else. The slight change in his expression when the translator spoke. The way he had looked at her journal when he thought she was not watching, not at the cover, but at the page she had been writing on. She set the book down with great care, precisely where she had found it, in the same orientation. She moved the basket back in front of it. She sat down on the edge of the fur bed and looked at the door. She was not certain yet what this meant. She was not the kind of person who drew conclusions from insufficient evidence, but she was the kind of person who noticed things and held them carefully until they had enough company to be understood. She noticed it. She held it. That evening Sato returned as the last light left the canyon walls and the temperature dropped with the sudden decisiveness that desert evenings have. He had been gone all day, she did not know where, and he came back with a measure of tiredness that he carried without complaint, stopping at the fire to check its state and adding wood with the automatic competence of long habit. He handed her a cup of tea and settled across from her, asking nothing in return for either. And they sat in the evening's silence, and she watched him from the corner of her vision and paid attention in a new way. He did not speak to her, but when a sound outside made her turn her head, his eyes moved to the door before hers did, and then moved back to the fire. Protecting something. Monitoring something. Not her, not exactly. The perimeter of the space where she was present. She noticed that too. She opened her journal and began to write, and he watched the fire, and the silence between them had a different quality. Now still respectful, still careful, but inhabited somehow in a way it had not been the night before, as though something very small had been established between them. Not trust. Trust was too large a word for what had happened in a day and a half. But the precursor to trust, the soil in which it might, under the right conditions, eventually grow. She wrote by firelight until her hand tired, and she did not write about the book. She wrote about Ada's hands in her hair, about the sound of the children, about the smell of the canyon in the cold evening air, about the particular warmth of the cup in her hands. Then she wrote at the bottom of the page a single line, Today is the 7th day since anything was expected of me, and I think I might be beginning to remember the shape of my own name." She closed the journal. Across the fire, Sato picked up a length of leather cord and began working it through his fingers, not aimlessly but with purpose, repairing something, tending to something occupying his hands, the way people do when they are in the presence of another person and want to be useful without intruding. She watched his hands, and she thought, whatever else this is, whatever it becomes or fails to become, this man has not yet lied to me. In a life shaped by the careful management of other people's comfort, in a town built on the social agreement to pretend that things were other than they were, this felt like something worth noting. She held it. Outside, somewhere beyond the canyon walls, the night moved in enormous silence over the Arizona desert, over the red rock and the dry riverbed and the scrub that had learned to live without certainty of water, and the stars came out in their abundance the way they always did out here, with a generosity that the daytime sky did not advertise. The fire burned. The man across from it repaired something she could not see. Clara Weston, daughter of a mayor who had made her a bargaining chip, former object of a promise that turned out to be an investment strategy woman who had learned to make herself small enough to be kept sat in a dwelling built into red earth in the Arizona territory, and breathed in and breathed out, and did not count the breaths. She did not need to. Not tonight. The seeds went into the ground on a Tuesday. Clara knew it was Tuesday because she had been keeping count in her journal, marking the days with a small line in the upper corner of each page, the way a person marks a wall when they are not sure how long they will be somewhere and want to be able to account for the time when they leave. She was not sure anymore whether she was counting toward something or simply counting the way she had once counted drops of water on a kitchen floor, because counting was a way of staying present in a body that sometimes wanted to be somewhere else. 17 days since Copper Hollow, 17 lines. She had found the spot 3 days earlier, a narrow shelf of ground along the creek's eastern bank, where the soil was darker than the surrounding earth and held moisture longer, where the cottonwood roots had broken up the hardpan below and left something workable in its place. She had pressed her fingers into it, turned a handful of it over, felt the weight and the texture of it with the seriousness she would have given to any important decision, and she had thought, yes, this could hold something. She did not ask permission. She did not explain herself to anyone. She simply came back the next morning with the folded cloth of seeds and a stick sharpened to a point, and she knelt in the dirt and began. She was making the 3rd row when she heard him behind her. She did not turn around. She knew it was Sato by the particular quality of his approach, the way his footsteps announced themselves without apology, but also without excess, the sound of someone who has learned to move through the world, taking up exactly as much space as he needs and no more. He stopped a few feet away. She kept working. After a moment she heard him kneel, and then she heard the sound of hands in earth, and she looked sideways and saw that he had moved beside her. Not behind her, not standing over her, beside her at a distance of perhaps 3 feet, and he was digging with his fingers, turning the soil, breaking up a clump of clay that she would have had to work around. He was not helping her exactly. He was not taking over. He was simply present in the work in the way that a person joins a task when they understand it without needing it explained. They worked in silence for a while. The creek made its small sound behind them. A pair of birds argued briefly in the cottonwood above and then resolved the argument and went quiet. Then Sato said without looking up from the earth, "My sister planted squash, every season, even when the ground was dry." His voice was low and measured, each word chosen with the deliberation of someone for whom English was a house he lived in, carefully aware of where the floors were soft. Clara pressed a seed into the row she was making. She thought about what she wanted to say, and she thought about what would be easy to say, and she decided they were not the same thing. "Was it good squash?" she asked. He stopped working. Just for a moment, just long enough for her to register it. Then, "Very good," and they went back to the work. She did not ask where his sister was. She had learned something in 17 days about the questions that did not need to be asked here, because the answer was already present in the way a person said a name, in the careful past tense of a sentence, in the particular quality of a silence that followed a particular kind of memory. She had grown up in a house full of that kind of silence. She recognized it now as the shape that grief takes when it has been lived with long enough to become part of the architecture. They finished the row together, then the one beside it. When the seeds were all in the ground, they sat back on their heels and looked at what they had done, which was objectively speaking a modest strip of turned earth with nothing visible to show for itself yet. But Clara had been planting things long enough to know that the moment of planting was not about what you could see. It was about what you knew was happening underneath in the dark, in the places where the seed was beginning the slow, blind work of deciding whether to trust the soil around it. Sato dusted his hands on his trousers and stood. He looked down at this garden for a moment longer, and she watched his face from her position still kneeling, and she saw something move through it that she did not have a name for yet. Not grief exactly, something adjacent to grief, something that grief leaves behind when it begins very slowly to become something else. Then he walked back toward the village, and she stayed at the creek and watched the water for a while and thought about sisters who planted squash in dry ground and mothers who pressed seeds into daughters' hands and all the ways that women passed things forward through time in the absence of any other available means. Ada found her there an hour later. The old woman came down the bank with her characteristic unhurried purpose, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She sat beside Clara without preamble and unwrapped the bundle, which contained dried berries and a piece of flat bread, and she divided these between them with the brisk efficiency of someone who has been feeding people for 60 years and has long since stopped making it complicated. They ate together. The berries were tart and intense, the bread dense and faintly sweet. Ada had been teaching her words for 3 days now in the oblique way Ada did most things, not in formal sessions, but in the course of ordinary moments, touching a thing and saying its name, looking at something and offering Clara its word in Apache, then waiting patient as a stone for Clara to attempt it. She seemed to find Clara's pronunciation genuinely interesting, if not exactly impressive, and she had a way of correcting it that felt less like correction and more like gift-giving, as though each adjusted sound were something she was handing over personally. Today Ada was quiet. She ate her portion of the bread and berries and looked out at the water, and Clara looked at her and wondered not for the first time what the old woman was thinking. Ada's face was not easy to read. It was a face that had held many things for many years and had learned to hold them without leaking. Clara had heard through the translator who moved through the camp on an irregular schedule and whose name was Henry, and who seemed mildly exasperated by everything that Ada had a daughter once. A daughter who had been taken by settlers when she was 8 years old in a raid on a camp to the south, and who had never been found and never been returned. Ada had been looking for her through the available channels, which were very few, for over 2 decades. She had not found her. She had continued to live anyway. With the specific, undemonstrative persistence that Clara was beginning to understand was not resignation, but something more complicated and more admirable, the decision to be present in a life that has given you genuine cause to absent yourself from it. Clara looked at her and thought, "I want to know how to do what you do." She did not say this. She was not sure it was a thing that could be asked. She suspected it was a thing that could only be learned by staying long enough to absorb it. She stayed. That evening she came back to the dwelling to find it different from how she had left it. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have named immediately. But there was a quality to the light inside, something warm and settled, and after a moment she identified the source. A small clay lamp had been lit on the shelf beside the baskets, filling the corner with a low amber glow that softened the angles of everything. She had not lit it. She stood in the doorway and looked at the lamp, and then at the rest of the room, and she saw that the blanket on her bed had been smoothed and that there was a cup of water on the table beside it, cool to the touch when she pressed her fingers to it. Small things, the kind of things that were easy to overlook and easy to attribute to coincidence. She did not attribute them to coincidence. She sat down at the table and opened her journal and wrote, "He sees the room I am in, not the one he expected me to be in. I am not sure what to do with that." Then Runs Far appeared in the doorway. She had not heard him approach, which was its own kind of message. He was perhaps 25, with a lean, angular face and eyes that were very dark and very direct, and he wore an expression she had been trying to classify since the first day she arrived. It was not hostility exactly. Hostility had a heat to it that she did not feel from him. This was something colder and more considered, the expression of a person who has decided on a position and is waiting for the evidence that will confirm or deny it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the lamp. Then he looked back at her. He said something in Apache, a short sentence, and then he was gone. She did not find Henry until the following morning to ask for a translation, and when she did, he scratched the back of his neck with the expression of a man deciding how much accuracy to offer, and then said, "He said, why does he bring light into his own house?" Clara thought about this for the rest of the morning. She was thinking about it still when 4 days later she was sitting near Ada's cottonwood in the late afternoon, watching Sato across the open ground of the village as he worked with a young boy on the mechanics of a bow. The boy was perhaps 8 or 9, with the particular combination of confidence and incompetence that characterized children of that age at any skill they were newly attempting. He held the bow with an authority that was entirely unjustified by his technique, and his first 3 attempts sent the arrow somewhere significantly off from its intended direction. One of them so spectacularly off that several adults in the vicinity took a step sideways without seeming to think about it. Sato did not react to this. He did not grimace. He did not take the bow and demonstrate the correct method in a way that would have made the boy feel small. He waited until the arrow had finished its eccentric flight, and then he walked over to the boy and crouched down to his level and adjusted the angle of his elbow very slightly, and then walked back to where he had been standing. The 4th attempt was better. The 5th better still. When the 6th arrow flew clean and straight and struck the target with a sound that was small but satisfying, Sato clapped once, just once, not loud, not theatrical, the single clap of a person acknowledging a fact. Then he handed the boy the next arrow and waited. Clara watched this from across the village and felt something shift in her chest, something that had been held at a slight tension since she arrived, not quite relaxing but easing the way. A muscle eases when you stop asking it to hold a position it was not designed for. She had seen men teach things before. She had watched her father instruct the men who worked for him with the characteristic impatience of someone for whom expertise has become indistinguishable from identity, so that another person's difficulty feels like a personal affront. She had watched Cole explain things to people with the fluency of someone who enjoyed explaining more than he enjoyed the thing being explained. She had watched men perform patience as a virtue, and felt the performance in it the slight self-congratulation underneath. This was not that. This was a man who was simply present with another person's difficulty without requiring anything from it, without needing it to be resolved on any particular schedule. The patience was not performed. It was just how he moved through time. She looked at his hands as he corrected the boy's grip and thought about those hands in the earth beside her, turning soil, breaking clay, working without ceremony or explanation. She thought about the lamp. She looked away before he could catch her watching. That evening she had been sitting outside the dwelling for perhaps an hour, writing by the last light, when she became aware that Runsfar was standing a short distance away, not approaching, just standing, watching her with the particular intensity of someone working up to something. She waited. He walked over slowly and stood before her, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached into the collar of his shirt and withdrew something and held it out. It was a bracelet, beaded with a pattern in red and white and a clasp of polished shell, clearly made by someone who knew what they were doing, who had spent time with it, who had made it for a specific person. She looked at it and looked at him. He said in English that was careful and broken and clearly costly, "My wife made this. She wore this." Clara went very still. He looked down at this bracelet in his own palm. 4 years ago, fire in the Eastern Valley, settler camp. He stopped, started again. We were there, not to burn, to take horses, but fire came. Another stop longer this time. My wife was in the wrong place. He looked up. Sato saw child in burning tent, white child. He pulled the child out. He said this without inflection, reporting it, not judging it. Then he ran toward settler camp to warn them. More settlers coming. The dark eyes did not waver. My people saw him running toward settler camp. They thought he told them we were there. Clara held herself very still. Did he? She asked. Runsfar looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. He only saved the child. But my wife was still in the fire. He had 2 hands, child in one, nothing in the other. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence she had been learning to inhabit in this place. It was the silence of a sentence that has not finished yet. She looked at him and she understood what she was being told and what she was not being told, and she understood that he was telling her this not because he had forgiven anything or resolved anything, but because he had been carrying it for 4 years, and he had decided, for reasons she could not entirely read, that she was someone who could bear the weight of it. I am sorry, she said. She meant it entirely. He closed his hand around the bracelet. He nodded once, a single movement that acknowledged her words without being changed by them, and then he walked away. She sat for a long time in the cooling air. Then she went inside. Sato was at the hearth tending the fire. He looked up when she entered, his usual brief attentive glance that checked the room and then released it. She sat down across from him. She thought about how to begin. She thought about all the ways she had learned to approach difficult things obliquely and carefully, and with enough preamble that the difficult thing could be reached at its own pace. Then she looked at his face, which was quiet and waiting, and she decided that oblique was not what this moment needed. "You understand English?" she said. "You have since I arrived." He did not flinch. He did not deny it. He looked at the fire for a moment, and then he looked at her. "Since I was 16, he said. "A missionary teacher, Morrison. He came to the camp for 2 winters. "Why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because when a person does not know you understand them, they say what is true. And when I knew you were coming, I needed to know what was true." She absorbed this. "And now?" "Now," he said, "I think you are someone who can be told." She looked at him steadily. "Runsfar told me about the fire." His jaw shifted slightly. A small movement, a door closing over something and then releasing it. "He has been carrying it a long time," Sato said. "So have you," Clara said. He looked at her then directly in the way he did, rarely the way that made her understand why he did it, rarely because it was not a comfortable thing to be looked at. Like that, seen that completely without the usual social distances that people maintained between themselves out of mutual courtesy. "Yes," he said, "I have." She held his gaze. "I would have done what you did," she said, "with the child." "You don't know that." "No," she agreed, "but I think I would have." The fire moved between them, small adjustments of light. Outside, the canyon held the last warmth of the day in its walls, and then let it go, and the temperature fell with the decisiveness of night in the desert. He reached out and added a piece of wood to the fire. She watched his hands do it. And something that had been a question in her since the first day she saw him began very quietly to become something else. The letter to Sheriff Roan took her 3 attempts. The first 2 she burned in the hearth, not because they were wrong, but because they were too right, too plainly accusatory, the kind of letter that would make Roan defensive before he reached the 2nd paragraph. She had watched enough of her father's political maneuvering to understand that the way a thing was said determined whether it was heard. The 3rd version was shorter and more oblique, and she was not entirely happy with it, but it was the best she could manage, and she gave it to Henry to carry to Copper Hollow on his next supply run, with the instructions that it should reach Roan directly and privately, not through the mayor's office. Henry looked at her with the expression he reserved for things he considered likely to complicate his life. "I'll see what I can do," he said, which was Henry's standard response to most things. She returned to the village, and she did not think about the letter. There was nothing to think about. She had done what she could do, and the rest was beyond her reach, and she had spent enough of her life worrying about things beyond her reach to know it was a waste of the finite number of hours she had been given. She went to the garden instead. 6 days after the planting, the first green had come up. Barely visible, a faint suggestion of color in the turned earth, more promise than evidence. She knelt beside it and looked at it for a long time, the way she would look at any living thing she had helped bring into existence, with a seriousness that was also underneath a kind of happiness she rarely allowed herself in full. Ada came and looked over her shoulder. Ada said with the inflection of someone who is reserving judgment but is not displeased. They need more water, Clara said. Ada made a gesture that was both agreement and dismissal. Meaning, yes, obviously, what are you going to do about it? Clara fetched water. It was on her fourth trip to the creek that she found them. She had taken the longer path around the south end of the village because the shorter path was muddy that week, and the longer path brought her past the eastern edge of the camp where a cluster of rocks provided natural seating that the older men used in the mornings. She was passing this area, her clay pot heavy with water, when she heard Runsfar's voice, and then a second voice that she did not immediately place, and then after a moment the specific cadence of someone speaking English as a second language, translating for someone who had none. She slowed without stopping. She did not intend to eavesdrop. But she caught the word Sato, and then the word council, and she stopped. She stood very still at the edge of the rock formation, the pot heavy in her hands, the water sloshing slightly. She could not understand the Apache words, but she could hear the tone of Runsfar's voice, which was not the low, weighted tone he used in personal conversation. It was the formal, projected tone of someone making a case before an audience. She found Henry 20 minutes later and told him what she had heard. He looked uncomfortable. "I wasn't there," he said. "What would Runsfar be saying to the council about Sato?" Henry looked at the ground, then at the sky, then at her with the expression of a man who has decided that the truth is less trouble than the alternative. "There's been talk," he said, "since you arrived. Some of the men think Sato having a settler wife makes the business with the child look worse. Like it wasn't a single moment, but a pattern." He paused. "Runsfar lost his wife in that fire. He never formally accused Sato before. He may be doing it now." Clara set the clay pot down. She looked at the village around her, at the dwellings and the fire rings, and the children playing in the open ground at Ada's cottonwood and the garden by the creek, at the space that had taken 17 days to become something she did not want to leave. She thought about what it meant to be accused of something you did not do, and to have no one in the room when the case was being made against you. She had some experience with that. She picked the pot back up. "Where is the council meeting?" she asked. Henry's expression suggested this was not a question he had expected. "Clara," he said in the tone of someone about to explain something for the first time that he considers obvious. "Where?" she said. He told her. She left the water for the garden and walked toward the large dwelling at the north end of the village, the one whose entrance faced east, the one she had been told during her first days was where the senior men gathered for formal discussion. She was aware as she walked that people were watching her. She was always somewhat watched in this village in the way a newcomer is watched anywhere, with a mixture of assessment and curiosity. But this morning the watching felt different, more focused, more laden. She did not look at anyone. She reached the doorway. She did not knock because there was no door, only a heavy hide covering. She moved the covering aside and stepped in. The council fire was small and central, surrounded by men seated in a loose arrangement that was not random, the specific placement of people in a room who know their position relative to everyone else in it. There were 7 men, including Runsfar, who sat with his hands on his knees and his face arranged in the formal composure of someone prepared to be witnessed, and Sato, who sat at the edge of the group with the stillness of a man who has been waiting for this for a long time and has decided to meet it without defense. Every head turned toward her. Clara stepped fully inside and let the covering fall behind her. She was aware that she had entered a space she had not been invited into, and she was aware of what that cost her socially in a context she did not fully understand, and she had decided in the 30 seconds between Henry's answer and this doorway that the cost was acceptable. She looked at Runsfar. She said, "I know I am not meant to be here. I will accept whatever is decided because of it, but I want to say one thing first." No one spoke. No one asked her to leave. She took this as permission, which it may not have been. She looked at the senior elder. A man named after the translation came back to her as something like Stone Marker, who was very old and very quiet, and had in her experience of him the quality of a person who makes large decisions appear small by the steadiness with which he receives them. She said, "I am a woman who has been made a bargaining piece twice in her life, once by a man I thought I might love, and once by my own father." She paused. "I know what it feels like when someone decides for you that you are not the right kind of person to be in a room." The fire between them moved in a brief draft from the doorway. She turned to look at Sato, who was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated and more stripped of its usual composure. She said, "That man could have left the child in the fire and no one would have known. No one would have asked. What he chose instead was the harder thing, not because it was safe or smart or useful to his own standing, because it was right." She paused. "If that is the act being questioned, I don't know what kind of man you would prefer in its place." She stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Runsfar looked at her for a long moment with his hands still on his knees. He did not look angry. He looked like a man staring at a shape he has been trying to see clearly for a long time and is only now, in this specific light, beginning to make out. Stone Marker looked at her, and then at Sato, and then at something in the middle distance that only he could see. He said something in Apache. Henry, who had apparently followed her and was now standing in the doorway behind her, translated in a low voice. "He says the council will continue its discussion. He says the woman who entered the room will be considered part of the discussion." Clara nodded once and stepped back to the wall. She remained there for the next 2 hours, understanding perhaps 1 word in 40, reading the room with the part of her that had always been better at feeling than translating. She watched Runsfar speak and watched the men respond and watched Sato sit with his hands open on his knees, not defending himself, not minimizing, just present, occupying his position in the room the way he occupied everything, with a steadiness that was not indifference, but its opposite. When the council concluded for the day, no final decision announced, Stone Marker stood and moved past Clara on his way out and paused. He said 1 word. Henry translated it later as seen. She was not certain whether it referred to her or to Sato or to something in the room she had not been able to perceive. She thought perhaps it referred to all of it. Outside, the afternoon was brilliant and harsh, the sun high enough to have burned away the morning's kindness. Clara stood in the open air and breathed it in, and felt the particular exhaustion of having spent herself fully in something important. Sato came out shortly after. He stood beside her, not close his usual careful distance. He did not say thank you. She had come to understand that he did not do that his gratitude expressed itself differently in adjustments of behavior in the small practical offerings that she had been collecting and cataloging like evidence. He said, "Why did you do that?" "Because it was true," she said. "You could have been asked to leave the village for it." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "You did not know what was being said in there. You did not have all the language." "I had enough," she said. "I know what it looks like when someone is being tried for who they are instead of what they did." He turned his head and looked at her. That full, direct look, she had learned, did not happen carelessly. "No one has done that for me before," he said. She met his eyes. "Then it was overdue," she said. He looked at her for 1 more long moment. Then he looked away back at the canyon walls, at the late light on the rock, at the ordinary details of the life around them. After a while he said, "My sister's name was Nala. The squash she grew was from seeds she had kept for 12 years. She said they remembered where they came from." Clara stood beside him and listened. "She died in childbirth 2 winters before the fire. The child, too." He paused. "I became the kind of angry that needs somewhere to go. And then the fire happened, and I pulled the child out, and Runsfar's wife was in the fire, and I had 2 hands." He stopped. "You've been carrying that," Clara said. "Yes. It wasn't your fault." "I know," he said. But knowing does not always change the weight. She understood this with a precision that did not require explanation because she had been carrying something similarly structured for 8 years. The particular weight of a thing you know intellectually is not your responsibility, but which has settled into your body as though it is. They stood side by side in the late light, not touching. The space between them was exactly what it had always been, deliberate and careful and respected. But something in it had changed. She could not have said exactly when it had changed or how, only that it had. It was that evening after the meal, when Sato was banking the fire for the night, that Henry appeared in the doorway with a letter. He handed it to Clara with his characteristic expression of someone delivering something he has decided is not his problem. The letter was from Roan. It was short and written in the compressed, careful hand of a man saying as much as he dared in writing. It said, "Your description of the man matches. Cole Devlin hired 2 hands from the Yuma stockyards 3 weeks before the cattle went missing. Both have since left the territory. I have one witness who saw money change hands but will not come forward without cause to believe it matters. Your father signed papers he should not have signed. I believe he was given no good choice. There is more I cannot put in a letter. Do not come back here, and do not under any circumstances let them tell you the Apache took those cattle." Below this, in a different pen as though added as an afterthought, "The fire 4 years ago. I have been thinking about it for a long time. Cole Devlin was in the territory that month. I did not ask the question I should have asked. I am asking it now." Clara read the letter twice. Then she looked up at Sato, who was watching her with the alert stillness of someone who has read a room and knows something has changed in it. She handed him the letter. He read it. He read quickly, and she noticed this too. The ease of it, the way his eyes moved across the lines without effort, and she thought of the worn copy of Emerson behind the basket of the teacher who came for 2 winters, of the 16-year-old who had decided to learn the language of the people who might one day take his land because knowledge was the only preparation that could not be stolen. He finished reading. He set the letter on the table. He looked at her across the small space of the dwelling, the fire between them, the canyon dark outside the village settling around them into its nighttime quiet. "Cole Devlin," he said. It was not a question. "He wants the water," Clara said. "The underground water on your land. There is enough of it to make the whole valley farmable. He cannot get it with a peace treaty in place. He cannot get it without a reason to bring the army." "So he makes a reason," Sato said. "Yes." She watched him absorb this the way he absorbed most things, without visible reaction, but with a depth of attention that she had come to understand meant he was processing at a level below the surface where the real thinking happened. "Your father," he said. "He signed something he shouldn't have signed. I don't know what yet." She paused. "He was probably afraid." She said this without heat. She had had enough time in 17 days of not being in her father's house to look at him from a distance that allowed something closer to clarity. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, which was not the same thing, and was also not entirely an excuse. Sato was quiet. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at him. She had been asked very few questions in her life, fewer still that were genuine, that actually wanted to know what she wanted rather than what she was going to do, which were questions that assumed the answer and were really just asking her to confirm it. This was genuine. She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "I want to stay here," she said, "and I want to make sure there is something to stay in." He nodded. The fire burned between them. Outside, the canyon held the night in its red walls, and the stars came out in their extravagance, and somewhere in the dark, a long way off, a man named Cole Devlin was planning something that had not yet arrived. But it would arrive. They both knew it would arrive, and when it did, they would be here, together. The words sat in the room between them, not spoken, not yet required to carry the full weight of what it might eventually mean, but present, quietly, steadily, unmistakably present, like a seed in dark soil doing the slow, blind work of deciding to grow. They came on a Wednesday. Clara knew it was Wednesday because she had counted 41 lines in the upper corner of her journal, and she was in the garden when she heard them. her hands wrist-deep in soil, checking the moisture around the base of the squash seedlings that had come up strong and definite in the 2 weeks since planting, greener than she had expected from this earth, more determined. She heard the horses before she saw them. Not 1 or 2 horses, the ordinary sound of the village's daily movement, but many a low percussion building from the eastern ridge, the sound of organized approach. She sat back on her heels and looked up. The birds went first. A cluster of them rose from the cottonwood along the creek, dark shapes against the morning blue, and Clara watched them go and felt something in her chest tighten in the specific way it tightened when a thing she had been expecting arrived before she was ready for it. She stood. She brushed the soil from her hands against her skirt, slowly and deliberately, the way she had learned to do small things slowly when large things were moving fast around her, because it kept her inside her body, and her body inside the moment. The Apache children playing near the creek stopped laughing. That was the detail that moved through her most sharply. Not the sound of hooves, not the dust beginning to lift above the eastern ridge, the silence of the children who had learned before any of them could name it what it meant when the adults in their world went still. Ada appeared at Clara's elbow without sound, the way she did most things, and looked toward the ridge with her arms folded and her face arranged in the particular composure of a person who has seen bad things arrive before and has made a private decision about how to meet them. She said something in Apache that Clara did not need translated. They came over the ridge in a line of perhaps 15 men riders in the dusty coats of militia, rather than the formal blue of the army, which Clara registered as important. The army had rules. Militia had conviction, which was a different and more unpredictable thing. Their rifles were strapped but present, and the morning light caught the metal at angles that were not accidental. In the middle of the line, riding with the particular ease of a man who has arranged for others to be uncomfortable so that he might be comfortable, was Cole Devlin. He looked exactly as she remembered him. That was the first thing she registered, the specific disappointment of finding that a person who loomed large in memory is precisely the same size in reality. Dark coat clean despite the ride, jaw set with the practiced confidence of someone who has rehearsed this scene and likes how it ends in the version in his head. He was looking at the village with the expression of a man who has already decided what he is seeing. Sato came out of the dwelling before the riders had fully descended. He stood in the open ground with 2 other warriors flanking him at a distance, and he waited. No weapon drawn, no posture of aggression. Just the stillness she had come to understand was not passivity, but its opposite. The stillness of a person who has nothing to prove and therefore requires no theater to prove it. Clara crossed the open ground and stood beside him. She did not announce herself. She did not look at him for permission. She walked across the dirt of the village she had been living in for 41 days, and she stood where she intended to stand, and she felt him register her presence at his side without turning his head, the small adjustment of a person who has noted something and taken it into account. Cole's eyes found her immediately. She had expected that. She had been the reason for this visit, at least the stated reason, and she watched his face as he took in the fact of her standing where she was standing, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, a small recalculation, the kind that happened when a scene was not running according to its rehearsed version. He dismounted. The militia held their positions. He walked toward her with the measured pace of a man who has decided to begin with charm, because charm was usually cheaper than the alternative. Clara. He said her name the way he always had, with a slight emphasis that implied it was more his word than hers. Thank God. She said nothing. He stopped at a distance of perhaps 10 feet. He looked at her face and then at the position of her feet, which were planted, and at the way her hands were at her sides rather than pressed together or tucked into her skirt, the way she had always held them in moments of social discomfort. He looked at all of this with his politician's eye for the significant detail, and she watched him understand that something had changed and that he did not yet know how much. "We've been worried," he said. He opened the word "we" to include the riders behind him, to include Copper Hollow, to include the idea that there was a community of concern that extended to her well-being. "There are stories getting back to town. People are saying you've been kept here against your will." "People are wrong," Clara said. Cole's jaw moved in the slight way it moved when he was revising his approach. "Come home," he said. "Your father needs you. The town needs stability. Whatever this has been, it doesn't have to be your whole life." She looked at him. She had loved this man once, or believed she had, which was perhaps the same thing at 19, and certainly not the same thing at 22. She had sat on her father's porch and listened to him talk about the future as though it belonged to him, as though futures were things that could be acquired with sufficient confidence, and she had confused his certainty for safety. She understood now that certainty and safety were almost never the same thing. "Cole," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. "Why are you here?" He spread his hands, an open gesture practiced. "I told you. We're concerned about the situation, about the cattle that went missing, about the agreements being honored." "The Apache didn't take the cattle." A silence, brief but textured. "You've been here too long," he said with the carefully modulated sympathy of someone whose patience is performing itself. "They've told you things. That's natural, but the evidence says otherwise." "What evidence?" 20 head of cattle missing, Apache camp nearby." "Proximity isn't evidence," Clara said. "You know that. You're too smart not to know that." His eyes changed. The warmth in them, which had always been performed anyway, dropped by a degree. "I came here to help you," he said. "You came here because a peace treaty is in your way," she said. "And I am the reason the peace treaty exists. So removing me removes the treaty. And removing the treaty means the army can be petitioned to move on Apache land, and on that land there is water." She paused. "Enough water to make this whole valley worth something to a man who got here early enough to file the right claims." The militia riders had gone very still behind him. Cole looked at her for a long moment. With the look of a man reassessing a piece on a board, he thought he understood completely. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said quietly. "I have a letter from Sheriff Roan," she said, "dated 11 days ago, which mentions 2 stockyard hands hired out of Yuma 3 weeks before the cattle went missing, which mentions a witness who saw money change hands, which mentions questions about where you were in the autumn of 1878. She watched this land. She watched the calculation behind his eyes, the rapid private accounting of what she knew and how she knew it, and what could be denied and what could not. She had seen her father do this in political arguments, the quick interior arithmetic of a man deciding what position could still be held. Cole's expression settled into something flat and careful. "A letter from Roan is not a court," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "But it is a beginning." Before he could respond, a sound came from behind her, from the direction of the dwelling where Runsfar had been keeping his distance since the riders arrived. She heard footsteps in the dirt and she did not turn. Immediately, she kept her eyes on Cole, but she heard the footsteps stop beside her and slightly behind. And then she heard a small sound, a child's sound, a murmur of something curious and unconcerned. Cole looked past her. She turned. Runsfar was standing 5 feet away, and in his arms held against his chest, with the practiced ease of a man who had been carrying this child for 4 years and would carry him for 40 more if necessary, was his son. The boy was perhaps 4 years old, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's. She had been told brightness of expression, and he was looking at the assembled militia riders with the frank assessing curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to manage his own reactions for an audience. He was wearing around his neck on a cord a small rusted bell. Clara looked at the bell. Beside her she heard one of the militia riders make a sound. She looked at the man, a broad-shouldered rider near the middle of the line, who was leaning forward in his saddle and squinting at the bell with the expression of someone matching a detail to a memory. "That bell," the man said. He looked at the man beside him. "That's a Dunmore bell. See the stamp on the side, Dunmore Ranch. I worked Dunmore for 2 seasons. That's their stamp." Cole turned to look at the rider with an expression that for the first time since he had ridden over the ridge was not fully under his control. The rider did not notice. He was still looking at the bell with the simple interest of a man recognizing a familiar object. "Dunmore sold out to Walcott 3 years back," another rider said, but they kept the old stock branded. Clara looked at Runs Far. He looked back at her. The bell at his son's neck, she understood now, was a found thing, something the boy had picked up somewhere and wound on a cord and worn the way children wore found things for the sound and the shine and no other reason. She looked at Cole. The Walcott cattle weren't stolen by Apaches, she said. The bell is here because a 4-year-old boy found it somewhere in this valley the way children find things. But if you want to know where Walcott's cattle actually went, I think Sheriff Roan's letter has some thoughts on that too. The militia was very quiet. Cole looked at the bell, at the child, at Clara, at Sato, who had not moved or spoken since the riders arrived, who had simply stood in the open ground with the patience of a man who understood that some confrontations resolved themselves if you did not add fuel to them. Cole's mouth opened, closed. He looked for the first time since she had known him like a man standing on ground that was not as solid as he had believed it to be, feeling the specific vertigo of that discovery. One of the militia riders said quietly to the man beside him, "I didn't come out here for this." Another, "Nobody said anything about a 4-year-old." Cole turned to them. He said something that Clara did not fully hear, something about standing firm and property rights and the law, and she watched his voice fail to do what it had always done before, which was to organize the room around his version of events. The men were looking at the child and at the bell and at each other with the expressions of people revising the story they had arrived with. Then a new sound came from behind the militia line from the direction of the eastern approach. A single horse moving at a steady pace unhurried the sound of someone arriving rather than charging. The riders parted to let him through. Sheriff Roan looked older than Clara remembered, or perhaps she was simply seeing him differently the way you see people differently when you have spent time away from them and the accumulated assumptions of familiarity have been cleared away. He was a compact man in his 50s with a weathered face and the eyes of someone who had been thinking hard about something for a long time and had recently come to a conclusion he did not entirely like. He dismounted. He carried a leather satchel. Henry had sent word to Copper Hollow 4 days earlier, the morning after Clara's letter came back with Roan's reply. He had not told Clara he was doing it. He had simply decided, with the quiet pragmatism that characterized everything he did, that a man who was already asking the right questions ought to know when the wrong people were saddling up. He walked past Cole without looking at him, which was its own kind of statement, and he stopped in front of Clara, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression that she could not fully categorize but that contained somewhere in it the specific quality of a man confronting a debt he had been running from. "Miss Weston," he said. "Sheriff Roan." He looked at Sato. He nodded once, the nod of one person acknowledging another person's legitimacy, simple and complete. Then he turned to face the militia. He opened the satchel. He said, "I have here a signed statement from a man named Curtis Hale, who was hired in Yuma in September of this year to move cattle from the Walcott Range to a holding pen in the Gila Valley. He was paid by a representative of Cole Devlin's Land Holding Company. I also have a signed statement from a woman in Copper Hollow who witnessed Cole Devlin meeting with a man she identified as Hale 2 weeks before the cattle went missing." He paused. "I also have documentation from the Territorial Land Office showing 3 water rights claims filed by Devlin Holdings in the past 18 months, all of them contingent on the dissolution of the current peace agreement with the Pinal Band." The militia had gone from still to something past still into the quality of silence that followed the recognition that a situation was different from what it had appeared. Cole said, "Roan, you don't know what you're doing." Roan looked at him with the eyes of a man who has made his decision and found it clarifying. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he said. "I'm doing what I should have done 4 years ago when I had questions I didn't ask." He looked at Sato when he said this. Sato received it with the stillness that received everything but Clara, who was standing close enough now to see the small movements of his face, saw something shift in it. Not relief exactly. Something that relief would become given time. Cole said nothing. 3 of the militia riders had already turned their horses. The others followed one by one with the quiet resolution of men who had come out for a straightforward job and found themselves in the middle of something they had not agreed to be part of. They did not look back. They rode up the ridge and over it and were gone. Cole stood alone in the open ground. He looked at Clara one more time. She had expected to feel something looking at him now, some version of the anger that had moved through her in the months after he left, or the residue of the feeling she had once called love, or the complicated satisfaction of vindication. She felt instead something much simpler and more complete. Distance, not the distance of grief or bitterness. The distance that comes when you have grown in a direction that a place or a person cannot follow, and you look back and see clearly for the first time how far you have come. She said nothing. He mounted his horse. He rode away without speaking, and she watched him go, and when the sound of his horse was gone, she turned back to the village. Behind her, Roan was speaking with Sato in the low, careful English of a man building a bridge one plank at a time. She did not interrupt them. She walked to where Ronsfar was still standing with his son, and she looked at the child who had apparently lost interest in the entire proceeding and was attempting to catch a grasshopper that had appeared in the dirt near his foot. She looked at Ronsfar. He looked at her. His face was not open. It was not warm. It held the same careful neutrality it had always held in her presence, the face of a man who has decided to withhold the conclusions he has not yet finished making. But he shifted his son slightly in his arms, and he looked at the bell around the boy's neck, and he said in his careful, costly English, "My son found this near the southern wash, 3 months ago. He would not give it back." A pause. "I did not know what it was." "It was important today," Clara said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes." She held his gaze. "Your wife," she said. "What was her name?" He blinked. It was a small movement, the smallest movement she had ever seen from him, and it was enough to show her that the question had reached somewhere past his defenses, not because it was clever, but because it was genuine. "Lena," he said. "Lena," Clara repeated quietly, giving the name back to him. He nodded. He held his son a fraction closer. The boy had caught the grasshopper and was examining it with intense concentration. They stood together in the morning light, the air still dusty from the departing riders, the village beginning to move again around them, children's voices returning smoke from the cooking fires, the ordinary sounds of people resuming the day. Then Ronsfar reached into his shirt with his free hand and withdrew the bracelet, the one Lena had made. He held it out. Clara looked at it. "You showed me this before," she said carefully. "Before I was showing you what I lost," he said. "Now I am showing you what I kept." He pressed it into her palm, closed her fingers around it. She held it and felt the weight of it. The small individual beads, the careful pattern, the clasp of polished shell made by hands that were no longer here. She looked up at him. She did not say thank you. She understood without having been told that this was not the kind of thing that was answered with thanks. It was answered with the willingness to hold it, to carry it forward, to let it mean what it meant without diminishing it by putting a smaller word on top of it. She closed her hand around the bracelet. Ronsfar nodded once. He walked away with his son, who was still wholly absorbed in the grasshopper and had no opinion about any of the rest of it. The hearing in Tucson took place in November, on a day when the desert air was cold enough to show your breath, and the mountains to the north had their first snow on them, white against the blue sky, like something that had been decided and could not be undone. Clara did not attend. She was not required to attend, and she did not want to. She had given her statement to Rowan in writing 3 pages in the deliberate script her mother had taught her, every detail she had observed and every inference she had drawn, and the clear line she had maintained throughout between what she had seen and what she believed, because she understood the difference mattered in rooms where things were decided. She learned the outcome from Henry, who came back from Copper Hollow with supplies and information in approximately equal quantities, and who delivered both with the same expression of mild exasperation that served him in all situations. Cole Devlin was convicted of fraudulent land claims and conspiracy to incite conflict for commercial gain. 12 years, the territorial judge had said, and the word had come back to Clara not with triumph, but with the flat satisfaction of a thing being correctly named and placed. The water rights claims were voided. A new agreement was drawn between the Penal Band and the Territorial Land Office, establishing shared access to the underground water for agricultural use by both communities. It required signatures from both sides, and when the document came to the village, Sato signed it first, and then Clara signed it beside him, and when the document was returned to the land office in Tucson, her name and his were on the same line, which she thought was right. Her father lost his position as mayor of Copper Hollow. He had expected this. He had, by all accounts, Henry brought back, already accepted it with the quiet relief of a man who has been holding a thing too heavy for him for too long and has finally been permitted to set it down. He signed over the mayor's house to the town and moved into 2 rooms above the hardware store and began in the way of men who have been reduced to their essentials and discovered the essentials were not so bad to live more honestly than he had lived before. She did not go to him immediately. She thought about it for 3 weeks, writing around the edges of it in her journal, approaching it from different directions, the way you approach a difficult piece of ground, testing the surface before you commit your weight. Then one morning in December, she saddled the dun horse and rode to Copper Hollow. It was the first time she had been back in 2.5 months. The town looked smaller than she remembered, which she had been told always happened, and which she had not entirely believed until now. The main street, with its 2-story facades and its frozen winter mud, was familiar in every detail and foreign in the way that places become foreign when you have grown at an angle from them. She found her father in the hardware store behind the counter, helping a man she did not recognize sort through a bin of nails with the focused attention of someone doing a small job very well. He looked up when she came in. He looked older. She had expected this. She had prepared herself for it. She had not prepared herself for the expression on his face when he saw her, which was not the expression of a man who expected forgiveness or who was performing contrition. It was the expression of a man simply looking at something he had not expected to see again and finding in the seeing of it more than he had earned. She waited until the customer left. Then she walked to the counter and she looked at her father across it, and she thought about all the ways she had rehearsed this conversation in her head, the things she had decided she needed to say, the accounting she had planned to ask for. She looked at him, and she let the rehearsed versions go. "You should have told me," she said, "that Cole had something over you. You should have told me before you signed my name on a document." He looked at the counter. "Yes," he said. "I could have helped you," she said. "Or I could have left on my own terms. Either way, you should have let me choose." He nodded. The nod of a man not defending himself, just receiving what was true. "I was afraid," he said. "And when I am afraid I make myself smaller and hope the thing passes. Your mother told me that once. She was right." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about her mother, which she did every day, and she thought about the particular way her father had managed to disappear from the rooms where her mother needed him while still being physically present in the house, and she thought about the girl she had been learning to be useful and invisible, learning those things from the man standing across this counter from her. She thought about all of it. Then she said, "I'm not coming back to Copper Hollow." He raised his head. "I have a life," she said. "Not the one I expected, but it's mine. I'm staying in it." His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen in many years. "Are you happy?" he asked. The question seemed to cost him something, as though he had been carrying it for a while and had decided to spend it. She thought about the garden by the creek, which would be dormant now in December, but whose roots were there alive under the cold ground, doing the slow, invisible work of winter. She thought about Ada's hands in her hair, about Run's Far and the bracelet and his son's grasshopper, about a small clay lamp lit in a corner of a dwelling by someone who had thought to do it, about Sato beside her in the open ground of the village, not because he was required to stand there, but because he had decided to. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. "Will you come back?" he said. "Sometimes." She looked at him. Not at who he had been, but at who he was now, standing behind a hardware counter with tired eyes and a posture that had shed its official weight and was just a man, just her father, imperfect and frightened and trying in the small way available to him in this late chapter to be better. "Yes," she said. Sometimes. She did not embrace him. She was not ready for that, and she thought he understood it, and she thought the understanding of it, the respect for where the line was more than he would have managed 2 years ago. She laid her hand on the counter briefly close to his, not touching, but near. Then she went back outside and she mounted the dun horse and she rode south toward the canyon. The ride back took 3 hours in the cold, and she spent most of it not thinking, which was unusual for her, but which felt correct in the way that certain silences feel correct after certain conversations. She watched the land change as she rode the flat scrub, giving way to the red formations she had learned by now, as well as she had ever known any landscape, each formation distinct, each one with its own angle and shadow depending on the time of day. She knew this land. That knowledge had arrived without her noticing it, arriving the way fluency arrives in a language, not in a single moment, but accumulated until one day you realize you are thinking in it. She came over the ridge above the village in the middle of the afternoon, and she stopped the dun horse on the rim and looked down. The smoke from the cooking fires rose straight in the cold, still air. The dwelling sat low and settled in the bowl of the canyon, part of the landscape rather than imposed on it. She could see Ada's cottonwood bare of leaves now, its enormous roots visible at the surface of the ground. She could see the bare garden plot by the creek, which would be green again in spring. She could see Sato in the open ground, sitting with a group of 3 children around. Something spread across the dirt between them. She was too far to see what it was, but she could see the way the children leaned in, and the way he pointed at something, and the way one child reached out to touch whatever was there. And Sato guided the small hand with 2 fingers, adjusting without taking over. She sat on the rim and watched this for a while. She did not need to see the details. She had learned to read him at a distance, the particular quality of his attention when he was with children, which was the same quality he brought to everything he considered worth his time, complete, unhurried, asking nothing back. She rode down. Ada was at the cottonwood as though she had not moved since Clara left that morning, though Clara knew she had, because Ada was never actually still. She was always doing something with her hands, even when her body appeared motionless. Today she was working on a length of fiber, twisting it into cord, and she looked up as Clara rode past and made a sound that meant in the language Clara had been learning something close to about time. Clara smiled. She put the horse in the small enclosure at the north end of the camp and gave it water and walked back through the village toward the dwelling. Sato was at the fire when she came in. He looked up. He had learned over 41 days, that had become 73 days, that she did not need to be greeted effusively, and that she preferred the kind of acknowledgement that treated her return as a matter of course, as the expected outcome of her going, which was the acknowledgement of someone who was confident she would come back. "How was it?" he asked. She sat down. She turned the bracelet on her wrist, Lena's bracelet, which she wore every day now. Not as a symbol of anything larger, but simply as a reminder of what it meant to be trusted with something that mattered to someone. "Hard," she said, "and right." He nodded. He handed her a cup of tea and went back to what he had been doing, which was its own kind of answer, which was repairing a section of the willow frame above the doorway that had loosened in a windstorm the previous week. She watched him work, and she drank the tea, and the fire was warm, and the canyon outside was cold, and the contrast between the two was a kind of luxury she had stopped taking for granted. After a while she said, "He asked me if I was happy." Sato did not stop working. "What did you tell him?" he asked. "Yes." He was quiet. His hands worked the willow into the frame with steady, practiced movements. "Was it true?" he asked. She looked at him, at the line of his shoulders, the way he stood when he was doing something with his hands, the quality of attention he gave to whatever he was doing, which was the same quality regardless of whether it was mending a frame or teaching a child or standing in the open ground of his village in front of men with rifles. She thought about the question the way she thought about all his questions, as a genuine inquiry that deserved a genuine answer. "Yes," she said. "It was true." He nodded. He finished working the willow into place and pressed it with his thumb to test the tension, and then he stepped back and looked at it, and apparently found it satisfactory because he moved on to the next thing without ceremony. She watched him, and she thought, I did not expect this. I expected fear, and I expected endurance, and I expected at best a manageable arrangement that might gradually become something less difficult. I did not expect this man with his 2 hands and his copy of Emerson and his sister's squash seeds in the back of his memory and his single clap of acknowledgement when a child does the thing they have been trying to do. I did not expect to be seen. But here was the remarkable thing, the thing she had been turning over for weeks, the thing that felt most true when she examined it carefully. Being seen had not made her smaller. It had not made her feel the exposure she had always feared, the vulnerability of being known. It had made her feel the opposite. It had made her feel like the full size of herself. She opened her journal. She wrote for a while by the firelight while Sato moved through the dwelling, doing the small attentive tasks of someone who understands that a life is held together by maintenance, by the daily noticing of what needs tending and the willingness to tend it. When the light in the smoke hole above had gone from gray to dark, he sat down across from her. He looked at her across the fire. She looked back at him. This was something they had learned to do over 73 days, to simply look at each other without making it into something it was not yet, or something it might become. To let it be what it was, which was 2 people who had been handed to each other by circumstance and had chosen daily, each in their own way, to remain. He said, "The council made a final decision today." She looked at him attentively. "About the accusations against you," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Stone Marker said that a man who saves a child and a woman who enters a council room on his behalf are the same kind of person. He said that kind of person is not a traitor. He said they are simply someone who has not yet learned to look away. She held this. "And Runsfar?" she asked. "Runsfar did not vote against me," Sato said. "He did not vote for me. He abstained." A pause. Stone Marker said that was enough. Clara thought about this. She thought about what it cost Runsfar to withhold the vote of condemnation, how it was not forgiveness and was not friendship and was not resolution, but was the thing that came before any of those things, the decision to stop feeding the wound. "That's something," she said. "Yes," Sato said. "It is." The fire moved between them. Outside, the canyon held the winter night the way it held everything, with the patience of something that has been doing this for longer than human memory can account for and expects to go on doing it long after. He reached across the space between them. Not suddenly, not with drama. With the same deliberate intention he brought to every physical act, the awareness that the space between people is a real thing and requires a real decision to cross. His hand opened palm up. She looked at it. She thought about the first time he had done this at the ceremony in Copper Hollow in front of her father and the crowd and the terrible weight of a world being arranged around her without her consent. She had placed her hand in his then because there was no other path available, and she had felt as she did it the warmth of his skin and had filed it away and not examined it. She examined it now. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, not tightly with the careful pressure of someone who knows the difference between holding and gripping. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "I asked to be part of the delegation," he said. "When the council was deciding who would go to Copper Hollow for the ceremony, I asked." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. He looked at their hands. "Because when the terms were explained to me," he said, "they told me the mayor's daughter would be standing on her father's porch alone, and they told me it would be against her will." He paused. "I thought whoever she is, she deserves someone who will not make it worse." Another pause, longer. "I did not know who she was. I only knew what I knew." Clara looked at him across the fire, across the 73 days, across everything that had happened between that porch and this fire. "You could not have known," she said. "No," he agreed. And yet," he said. She turned her hand in his, so that their fingers interlocked, the deliberate kind of holding, the kind that required the cooperation of both parties. She felt his hand warm around hers. She thought, this is not the story I was told. Not the one I told myself either in the years when I believed that what I was waiting for was someone who would come and make things right. What I found instead was something different, and she thought better. Not rescue, not completion, just another person standing in the same imperfect world trying to do the harder thing and willing on an ongoing basis to stand beside someone else who was doing the same. I was not what you expected, she said. No, he agreed. You were more. She felt something in her chest that was not quite tears and not quite laughter, but lived somewhere between them in the territory of feeling that does not have a precise name because it is too specific to any particular moment, too alive to be pinned with a general word. She held his hand. He held hers. The fire burned down to a steady, reliable warmth. They sat with it as the night deepened around the canyon, as the stars appeared above the smoke hole in the numbers she had never imagined before coming here, as the cold pressed in at the edges of the dwelling and was held back by the simple, sufficient warmth of fire and walls, and two people who had decided in the absence of any guarantee about what tomorrow looked like to be here for tonight. It was spring when the squash came up. Clara was in the garden when it happened, on her knees in the turned earth, checking the moisture levels with 2 fingers pressed into the soil, and she looked up, and there it was, the first curl of green from the seeds that Runsfar had left in her palm, without ceremony or explanation, coming up in the April light like an announcement. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. She heard footsteps behind her, small running footsteps, and then the warm weight of a small body appearing at her side, and a child's voice. "What is that?" She looked at Runsfar's son, who was 4 years old and called himself by a nickname she still could not pronounce correctly, and who had decided several weeks ago that Clara's garden was one of the more interesting places in the village, probably because she did not tell him not to touch things. "Squash," she said. "Your father gave me the seeds." The boy looked at the green curl with the serious concentration he brought to things he considered important. "Can you eat it?" he asked. "When it's bigger?" Clara said. "In the summer." The boy thought about this. "Sato says his sister grew squash," the boy said with the matter-of-fact authority of a child reporting information. "She did," Clara said. "These seeds might be from the same kind." The boy reached out one finger and touched the green curl very gently with the care that children sometimes surprise you with. "Hello," he said to it. Clara looked at this. She felt the feeling that had no precise name, and she let herself feel it fully without managing it or minimizing it or storing it away for later examination. She pressed her hand flat against the earth beside the small green growing thing, feeling the cold of the soil and the distant suggestion of warmth beneath it, the warmth that had been there all winter waiting. She heard Sato's voice from across the village calling the boy's name, and she heard the boy's running feet departing, and then she heard Sato's slower approach, and then his shadow fell across the garden and she looked up. He looked at the squash. She watched his face. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the green unfurling there in the red earth, and his face held the thing it always held when something moved him, not its expression, but its opposite, the stillness that came down over him when a feeling was large enough to require the whole surface of him to contain it. He said, she would have said it remembered where it came from. Clara looked at the squash. She thought about seeds that carried memory in them, that knew what kind of thing they were supposed to become, regardless of where they found themselves. She thought about her mother's hands pressing seeds into her own, and the long, strange road those seeds had taken to arrive here in this red earth, in this canyon, in this life she had not chosen and had made her own. "I think she would have been right," Clara said. Sato sat down beside her in the dirt of the garden simply and directly, the way he did most things in the same movement he had made 70 days ago, simply present in the work. Simply present. They looked at the squash together. In the cottonwood down by the creek, birds were making their spring noise, the specific chaotic optimism of birds in April, who have things to build and no time to waste on uncertainty. The creek was running higher now, fed by mountain snowmelt, and the sound of it carried up from the bank and filled the morning with its clean, continuous argument. Ada came from the direction of her tree, walking with her stick, and without apparent hurry, and she stopped at the edge of the garden and looked at the squash with the expression she reserved for things that had earned her attention, which was the same expression she gave to a well-made basket or a correctly identified plant, or occasionally to Clara. She said something in Apache. Sato translated, "She says you planted well." Ada looked at Clara directly then. She raised one finger and touched her own chest, and then pointed to Clara, and she said in English the word she had given Clara, the two-syllable word in her language that Clara had learned meant something like, "The one who plants what others doubt will grow." Clara looked at her. "I know," Clara said. "I'm keeping it." Ada nodded once with the finality of someone who never expected otherwise and walked back toward her tree. Clara looked at the garden, at the squash, at the turned earth dark with moisture ready for the season. She looked at Sato beside her. He looked at her. No speech, no declaration, no ceremony beyond the simple ceremony of being two people sitting in the morning light in a garden that had been grown by their hands together in a place that had become home, not because it was given to her, but because she had stayed long enough and worked hard enough and loved carefully enough that the earth had recognized her and held her in return. She reached over and pressed her hand into the soil beside the squash, beside the memory of his sister's seeds, beside the promise of something sweet and good coming up from the ground in the months ahead. He pressed his hand into the soil beside hers. Their fingers touched. The canyon held them. The creek ran. The birds built. The squash grew. And Clara Weston, daughter of a frightened man and a small-town woman who had been traded like a bill of sale woman who had learned to make herself useful and small and had finally in the red earth of a canyon in Arizona learned to make herself fully herself, stayed. She chose it every morning. And every morning it was the right choice. That she had come to understand was what love was. Not the moment of declaration, not the ceremony, not even the feeling which came and went and changed its shape with the seasons. It was the choosing, again and again and again, until the choosing itself became as natural as breathing, as necessary as water, as deep as roots in red earth. The end.